So a lot of what we've done right now is dealing with how to create an infectious message. And what you'll note is that in the process of trying to make a message break through, your brain starts to think about all those people you need to convince. And sure, you need to convince the end consumer, but there's also a lot of internal people that you might need to convince. Your boss, your managers, your team, your employees. That's actually a pretty big issue. And so what we find in our research and our work is that the concepts of infectious messaging are also closely related to the concepts related to our first learning module on the ability to change. So I wanted to give you a bonus workshop that is from my experience in trying to help some CEOs and billionaires actually change their mind. So this is one of my favorite workshops, and I'll talk to you about how I stumbled into it, and then we'll get into the meat of it. So this is a workshop if you need to get buy-in. And I would say that that's probably one of the top questions that I often get. How do we structure the workshop to get buy-in from our CEO, from the founder, from the board, from the team, whatever it might be? And of all of the workshops that I do, there's a couple that spike out, but the one we're going to dive into that is a personal favorite is the pace of change. And here's how it works first from a history perspective. I had published Exploiting Chaos in about 2008. That's where I wrote it in 2007 and 8. And then the world became very chaotic. So suddenly I started becoming the chaos expert. And you help one CEO, you get invited by another and another, and now you're the chaos guy. But the other thing that was happening at the same time is that our website was starting to get more traffic than every newspaper on the planet, really. And so then all of the first clients for me in my early career of a sort of what we're doing at Trend Hunter, they were all the media CEOs, billionaires, and brands. And I learned a lot, but they were trying to figure out how does this little site run by 10 people get more traffic than us. And so it was interesting to work with them. And what I found is that they were typically huge organizations, very powerful and capable of a lot in the old world of business. But it would be very difficult for me to convince them that the world was headed towards streaming and all the things that you're very comfortable with today. And I started to feel that people all know the past, they all know the present. And I also felt that the CEOs I was working with were pretty good at knowing the distant future. I had a conversation with a billionaire media guy that you would know, and in this boardroom, I asked, well, where do you think the world's headed? And he said, oh, eventually it's virtual reality and streaming and all of that, but not now. And then he goes, Jeremy, do you stream my TV shows? And I was like, oh, yeah, how do I answer that one to this guy? And then I just said, yeah, you know what, I do, and my friends do, and everyone I know does. And I think what's weird is the more I talk to your team, I realize they might too, but you're creating your own filter bubble where internally you don't want to face that issue. And streaming music or movies was, illegal back then and before Netflix and all these created legal solutions. And so people didn't want to admit it. And so what I started to realize, and this is a decade past, so I believe that one of the most difficult things is that people are terrible at predicting 3 to 5 years out. In your industry, you're great at 10 years out. You're actually really good at next year unless there's a global pandemic. But the tough part is 3 to 5 years out. And a proof point that's kind of interesting is that you see a lot of companies get disrupted where you might feel you could have predicted what they should have done. Smith Corona should have pursued the laptop word processor that they invented. Kodak should have pursued the digital camera they invented. Xerox should have pursued the personal computer system, the mouse, the graphic user interface that they invented. But they don't. And what happens is that internally within a company, our own sense of control, we overestimate and then we underplay the trends that we kind of see are happening. And yet from the outside, you could look at any of these industries and you could predict what's going to happen. And so what's going on and how do we get people that within our companies to stop extrapolating the status quo? How do we get people to wake up and realize the disruption that could come? And if you could do that, you would actually be much better at selling your new idea. Humans are resistant to change. After 10,000 years of evolution as farmers, we cling on to the path we're on and we try and repeat the decisions that led to last year's harvest. So how do we break out? Well, if we're good at linear thinking, but we're bad at exponential, it's an interesting paradigm because there's actually a lot of clues in the world that can show you how exponential change is happening. You can do the math. You can figure out. And so one of the workshops that I like best is to try to help you, and I'm going to show you how to run this, get your team to internalize exactly what is the pace of change in your industry. Because if you could internalize that we're not just more advanced, but that the pace of change is accelerating, well, then you'd be wiser at predicting exactly what's next and what will happen in 3 to 5 years. You could be better at creating urgency and telling people why we need to move, act now, invest, try new things. And you'd be more likely to convince your team that it's time for action. So let's get into the workshop. Let's dive right in. I stumbled on thinking through how to make this happen when working with those media CEOs, and I'm going to rewind you back to 2010, and I'm going to show you the workshop I did the first time I did it, and then I repeated it with 30 CEOs and brands and boards and even some billionaires in media. And I will tell you, this was the most effective tool at changing a CEO's mind and creating urgency. It's kind of simple, but I'd say, okay, it's 2010. I know you want to know about 2015. So it's 2010, you care about 2015. But let's do a different game and let's talk about 2020. Let's talk about 10 years out. And I found they would always be good if you picked a really far out number. And you're probably really, really good at your industry. You're much better at your industry than I am at predicting really far out, because you think about that stuff. And they'd say, well, movies will have virtual reality. They'll be interactive and choose your own adventure. There'll be video games. You as a character, you could have a beacon to know who's in the audience. There'll be a big shift to what gets experienced in the theater, which is versus what gets streamed. And maybe any movie could be streamed. Now here's the thing. That slide is from 2010. Guess what? Virtual reality did take off. Netflix did pioneer choose your own adventure in 2018 and 19. Video games and movies did change. Video games took over in revenue, and Hollywood actors started doing video games. Your face can be made into a character, particularly with Yao, the Chinese app that puts your face on anything. And the big shift in terms of what gets experienced in the theater is that since people started streaming things online, often illegally, the theater became the place for the Marvel-type action movies. Wow, everything there came true. That comes from one conversation with a CEO 10 years ago who would not have actually planted any of those things as actually happening in 2015. But they did happen in 2015 and earlier, many of those, and you know that. So what's the workshop then? I asked them to look and quantify the pace of change in their industry by taking a time period 10 years before and comparing it to now. So in 2010, I asked these CEOs, what was the movie industry like in 2000? How did you see a movie? Well, we would go to a newspaper and open it up to look at the reviews. You'd call the theater for showtimes, beep, boop, beep, boop, beep, boop, beep. You might use the yellow pages to find their actual number. You'd invite your friends by leaving a message on their answering machine. You'd ignore inviting a big group to the movies because it's too complicated to do. You might use a paper map to find the theater, and you'd show up and it was sold out. Wow, everything on that page is completely different. By 2010, just 10 years later, you would go on Rotten Tomatoes to see what's the rating. You'd book your ticket online. You don't know what the yellow pages is. You'd text your friends. You'd text more friends. You'd use a GPS to get to the theater. You would show up with a ticket because you'd order online. And while you're waiting, who knows, you can online shop. That's actually phenomenal. But pause and put yourself in the seat of a CEO running a company that does movies and media. And you look at that and you stop and you reflect and you see how much happened in 10 years and you start to internalize the pace of change. You can pick what the time intervals are, but the general exercise is to spend 10 minutes first forecasting your distant future with your CEO, your team, your leadership. Involve people, co-create. And then break down what was the present like and what was the past 10 years ago, let's say. And you'll be shocked at what actually happens when you go through the process, because it's one of the most powerful exercises to wake up and realize what could happen. The next step is I start to build scenarios where you imagine any of these ideas actually take hold earlier than you thought because a competitor did them, or a competitor bought a small little startup and scaled them up. And by going through some of those scenarios, you can actually prepare yourself to be better at winning in a 3 to 5 year timeline out. If you're looking for a little bit more instruction on how to figure out where your super future is headed, you can go to the trendhunter.com/megatrends website, and you can start to explore our different megatrends, our patterns, or go back to how those lessons were described and applied in the previous lessons. The main trick, though, in this whole bonus workshop is to sit back, look at the pace of change, and then realize that your 10-year predicted future is probably what could happen in 5. And if you take that mentality, you're better able to shock people into action. The outcomes: urgency, increased buy-in, and likely better predictions at the time frame that humans are inherently bad at, 3 to 5 years out. Here's the workshop. If you want to replicate it, step 1, create the far distant forecast, such as 10 plus years in the future. Step 2, identify all the aspects of your business from 10 years ago. Step 3, compared to today, internalize the pace of change. I have 10 years and 10 years there, but depending on your industry, whether you're in theme parks or beverages or technology, you might change those to make some sort of time frames that work better for you, and then shock yourself in action and use that to build some scenarios. Now, I'm going to end on a slightly different example. We've had an amazing journey going through all the modules of Create the Future, and often when people think about charting their future or the word innovation, innovation can seem daunting. It gets blown out of proportion, when in all likelihood, innovation can be simpler than you think. So I want to tell you about the tale one day where one of my colleagues showed up, and she showed up at work and said, "I'm exhausted." And I said, "Why are you exhausted?" And she said, "I've been being chased by zombies for 4 hours, running as fast as I can from zombies." And you know, your first inclination is to laugh, but guess what? The doubters get eaten first. So you always have to pay attention. And then after listening to this story, I realized it's not really what I think. It's that 1 million years ago, humans discovered fire. Fire led to bombs. Bombs led to cannons. Cannons led to hand cannons. Hand cannons led to rifles. Rifles led to bullets. Bullets led to rockets. Rockets led to Russians winning the race to space with Sputnik in the sky, which then orbited around the world, sending a beacon signal to the Americans. Beep, 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 beep. We did it, we did it, we did it. You didn't. That made the Americans very upset. So a couple Americans said to their boss, "Hey, can we use the supercomputer? Because we think from the ground you could triangulate where this stupid Sputnik is in the sky." Their boss let them do it because their boss said, "I love that idea because I have nuclear submarines." Wait, I don't get it. Well, if we took your little idea and we put it in the sky and pointed it downwards, well then we could actually find where my submarines are. And pretty soon the Coast Guard was interested, police, fire, and emergency rescue. And as soon as maps started becoming a thing, people were racing around the world, geocaching and searching for hidden treasure. Add in your smartphone, and now Google knows how to make a map that gets you to wherever you are today. Social media becomes a thing, and now the only reason that I, Jeremy Gutsche, run is because the Nike Plus app lets me compete with Jamie in my office and maybe see if I have a chance at having one little victory on any particular day. Later on, the AMC famous show The Walking Dead, and now it becomes a little more clear because my colleague was actually using an app called Zombies Run, and she wasn't being chased by zombies, but as she ran, she kept getting interrupted in her music by a narrative story telling her, "Watch out, the zombies are 300 meters behind you. You need to keep on walking and running towards the school." Wow. Now, what's the point of this story, this little riddle that I've given you? Well, no one person invents GPS. No one person invents Google Maps. We tend to think that innovation in our next level is some big, grand idea, but actually, you don't need big ideas. You really just need a little idea that you can make big. And I'll wrap up by noting you have more opportunity than you think. All of us have another level we can be playing on. That level is so close within your grasp. You got it. You can get to it. But you have to be careful of all the traps that block us from getting to the new level and cause us to just keep on repeating past decisions. The secret to remarkable success is not just hard work, but it's also recognizing that it's an overlooked opportunity that you're pursuing. And if you can do that, you will truly create the future. And that ends our section on infectious messaging. Make sure you push yourself to come up with those 7 words or less, that way of articulating your story that makes me want to choose you. And as you get more buy-in and you have people so excited about what you do, I hope that you push the world to a wonderful creative future and help us create the future we actually all want to live in. Thank you very much for taking this course.